Hello, welcome to my lecture on Charlemagne and his kingdom, and continuing on basically these small lectures or these short lectures on what contributes to the modern world. And remember, the entire theme of this course is, as brief and as pithy as it is to help find elements or small things that contribute to what make the modern world and what leads to our society today. Even though some of these events were thousands of years ago, they obviously contribute to the rise of human development and humanity in general. And so that's why we are looking at them. In this particular case, what I want to talk about today is totally different than the rise of Islam, although what I'm talking about today eventually clashes with Islam. And basically, it's what happens in the western half of the Roman Empire. To set the context so that you're familiar with this, remember the Roman Empire was split in two. The Byzantine Empire rose in the east, and in the west, it was basically chaos. It was what was called the barbarian invasions. It's been a while, but I talked about the barbarian invasions, and this was a period of time when the tribes which were not Roman, a series of tribes, roamed through what was the Roman Empire, um, destroyed even the city of Rome. They set up their own little kingdoms. They rose and they fell as new tribes competed with one another. It was a very dark time, hence the term Dark Ages, although that is a misnomer. It was just an unsafe period of time. And it was a period of time when there was no real political unity or geographical unity like the Roman Empire had. Remember, the Roman Empire was built on the Roman peace, establishing a political unity, an economic unity, and a geographic unity. None of those things existed from the late 300s to the 700s, and that is because of the chaos of the period, the barbaric invasions. All of this ends, I shouldn't say all of this ends, but it comes close to ending in the year 800 when a man named Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor or Emperor of Rome. Now, that should seem shocking because the Roman emperors in the West had disappeared. In the East, they became the Byzantine emperors. In the West, there was no Roman emperor. There was no emperor in the city of Rome for at least 400 years. But Charlemagne, who is the individual I'm going to be talking about, is one of the greatest historical figures of all times. It cannot be understated how important he was. Hopefully, you've heard of Charlemagne. His name means Charles the Great in French, Carolus Magnus. That's actually Latin as well. And he is an important figure, and I'm going to be talking about him extensively today. But to put it in timeline, um, he restores the Roman Empire in the West. At least that's what he claimed, and that's what becomes the myth, if you will. Um, he establishes what is called the Holy Roman Empire because it was Christian. Critics have said it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and that all may be technically true. But the idea of Rome continues through the person of Charlemagne, and so therefore we need to know who he is. Where did he come from? What was this all about? Why is he so significant? If nothing else, you'll learn something about the importance of this particular man who lived well over 1,200 years ago. Okay, so who was Charlemagne? Well, first of all, Charlemagne is a descendant of the Frankish kings. The Frankish kingdoms and the Franks are one of the many Germanic tribes that emerged in the chaotic period following the fall of Western Rome. Remember, there are the Lombards, there's the Huns, there's the Goths, both Visigoths and Ostrogoths. There's the Angles, the Saxons. These are all tribes, which some of these names should be familiar with you to this day. These were tribes that lived on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. They rose in significance, many times moved to a place and then settled. And some of their place names are still with us today. In northern Italy, there's the kingdom of Lombardy. It's a region in Italy today. That's because the Lombards were a tribe, a clan that rose, moved to northern Italy, and then settled there. The Vandals, that word Vandal, to steal, to loot, those were Germanic. That was a Germanic tribe that raided and rode across the Roman Empire and raided every village they could find. They eventually settled in northern Africa. The Franks, which is where we get the word France, is one of those tribes as well. And it emerged into significance under a man named Clovis in the 400s. Clovis was one of the first Germanic leaders, not the first, but he's one of the first to unite his tribe through Christianity and then to unite foreign tribes with Christianity. Religion was a way of uniting peoples and getting them to pledge allegiance to their leaders. They did so through the military boot, obviously, and if you remember my lecture about the barbarians, this is one of the ways that they uh, conquered kingdoms and societies was to unite people with both military and then eventually religion. Clovis was one of the great leaders who united the Franks and established a stronghold in what is today northern France and also what is today Western Germany. Remember, they're a Germanic tribe. It's one of the great ironies of history that at one time the Germans and the French were united as in bloodline, and then eventually they descend into some of the greatest enemies in history. Excuse me, fighting off a cold here. But nevertheless, and uh, these Franks, these series of leaders from Clovis on down, uh, were significant in uniting their tribe and building a strong kingdom. It's not an empire; it's a kingdom. And they eventually fought battles with their neighbors and were significant military leaders in that. And they slowly built a strong empire. Now, there was lots of infighting among these Franks, lots of civil wars amongst themselves, jockeying for positions for rulers. It's actually some very interesting reading. There's a lot of backstabbing, a lot of intrigue and marrying, and see who was going to take the throne for 200 to 300 years. The reason Charlemagne is significant is he's a descendant from this tribe, and eventually takes complete and utter political control. I'm going to talk more about him in a second. What you need to understand is his grandfather, a man named Charles Martel, was the real linchpin in setting up Charlemagne. Charles Martel was a genius military leader whose great significance was defeating Islam and Islamic invasion in the year 732 at the Battle of Tours. Um, the Battle of Tours is one of the great military moments in Western history. Islam had made an advance all the way through Spain and was ready and set perhaps to conquer what is today Europe, and it was stopped by Charles Martel. Now, there's apocryphal stories. We have some evidence to believe that it's partially true, but one of the geniuses of Charles Martel was he created the stirrup for his soldiers, and so therefore he could stay on his soldiers could stay on their horses while they did battle, whereas the enemy could not. Um, Regardless of whether that's 100% true or not, we know that by that time they did have the stirrup, and it was one of the great small things that changes history. It is often considered to be the battle that stops Islam from overtaking Europe for at least, I mean, there are many attempts, by the way, all the way into the 1400s. That is one of the key battles that splits or separates Christianity from Islam. Islam was stopped kind of cold and then eventually moved entirely. They had to retreat, and they had some bases in Spain. And if you know anything about Spanish history, there is a heavy Islamic influence in Spain, but eventually they are removed entirely within 100 to 200 years. So the point is, Charles Martel, by doing that, is considered a hero to the Frankish tribes, which were all pledged to Christianity. And on top of that, he's a military hero and has enormous power. So, in other words, the Franks really rise in power after the Battle of Tours in 732. And Charles Martel um, is the centerpiece of what is called the Carolingian Empire. That means Charles. In French, Carol is Charles, and there's a series of Charles, and they're called the Carolingian Empire. His Charles Martel's grandson, all right, is the son of another strong leader, a man named Pepin the Short, who was the son of Charles Martel. But Pepin keeps a strong organization for the Franks, and that's significant. Remember, these are barbarians. There wasn't a long, like a strong bureaucracy in many of the other tribes. The Carolingian Empire, including Pepin, who was the son of Charles Martel, I know this all can be confusing, but um, his son established a strong bureaucracy. I want you to think about that. Charles Martel, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne, had a strong military um, and significant rise to power and united the Frankish kingdoms and united his enemies or conquered his enemies. And then his son, Pepin, is a strong bureaucrat who builds a strong bureaucracy, which, by the way, means more taxes, means more wealth, means more power. And then Charlemagne comes in. Charlemagne is the grandson of Charles Martell. He becomes a significant heir in the 760s, and it's piecemeal. He gains more and more power, and then eventually he takes complete control as king of the Franks in the late 760s. And then he spends the next 30 years establishing an empire. Now, what's the difference? A kingdom is a united political entity of the same people or one territory. An empire is many peoples or many territories under one leader. An emperor does not only rule his own people, he rules other peoples. And Charlemagne, and this is key, is one of the great military and political geniuses combined in history. There are several of them, and they are of note. Okay, Napoleon was both a political and military genius, and he is some considered the great descendant of Charlemagne, meaning he's trying to establish and do the exact same thing. There are others that Caesar might have been one of the first. Caesar was a military genius and a political genius. Whenever you see that combination, it's usually lethal in history. Um, they stand out for a reason, and that is certainly one of them. Charlemagne is one of those great geniuses in history who spends 30 years building an empire, not just a kingdom, but an empire. And he does so by slowly conquering on the battlefield using the legacy of his grandfather and his father to build to build alliances and to build loyalty from military commanders. And he does. He's not alone on the battlefield. He has a genius for picking talent, and he uses his wealth that he builds to reward his generals and to reward people who become loyal to him. This is the feudal system in place. In some cases, you can make the argument that what we know about knights in shining armor, there's a famous poem called the Song of Roland, which was about the famous knight of Charlemagne. Um, in other words, this idea of a king who rewards his soldiers, and they become nobles, and they have estates, and they have lands. A lot of that is established in this particular period of time. And Charlemagne is significant because he conquers militarily a territory. And keep in mind, he's still in many ways a barbarian. He's brutal to his enemies, um, but he's also a bureaucratic genius in the sense that he builds this empire, establishes a system of taxation, a system of loyalty, a system of pledging, and a system of fortifications as well, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Um, but when everywhere he goes, he establishes people who will follow him. And if they don't pledge loyalty to him, if they're not loyal to him, he has them eliminated. And he builds a series of fortifications on the rivers of Europe that builds a strong and incredibly strong system um, of empire. Really, is what it is, and wealth flows into Charlemagne's court. Um, and we'll talk more about what happens to his eventual descendants, but nevertheless, he's huge. Okay, so from the late 760s to the year 800, he slowly builds this empire. By the year 800, he has definitely an empire that includes most of Europe, what we know about Europe today. That's huge. I mean, that's France, it's Germany, it's Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy, parts of Spain. Uh, what is today continental Europe was mostly under Charlemagne's control by the year 800. Uh, Look at the map that is also on your lecture sheet. If you see that map, you'll notice that it is most of Europe. Some have made the case that today's Europe was established by Charlemagne, that the entities, the counties, the places of government, they go all the way back to Charlemagne. Now, obviously, it's ebbed and flowed. The borders have changed, but the idea of the country of Germany, which by the way doesn't exist until the 1800s, but all the little principalities, nobles, the kingdoms that established that were once part of or that are part of Germany today, all those were could draw their legacy back to Charlemagne in the year 800. By the year 800, France, obviously, again, Spain, Italy. And by the way, even countries that weren't technically part of his empire, he made alliances with, that he controlled, that he got tribute from. In other words, he basically threatened them, kind of like the Romans, either you pay me or I'm going to come invade and I'm going to conquer you. Some of the kingdoms that are in Spain and some of the kingdoms that are in southern Italy, that's exactly what he did. So he's a significant individual and he's got this huge geographical territory and empire. It is officially all united as an empire when the Pope crowns him emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. Now, this is a debatable moment. How significant was this? How big was this? Um, he had already had an empire by the year 800. But when the Pope crowns him and the church basically says this is God's chosen emperor and all Christians will unite under him, it is a highly symbolic moment. It is a symbol that the church has that kind of authority, that the Pope, um, who who was supposed to be just in charge of Christians and Christian pastors, recognizes a temporal authority. And again, that idea of there's the church authority and there's the local ruler. Well, here the local ruler happens to be Christian, and he's given his crown by the church. This is going to be, I mean, it works for Charlemagne. He used it as a moment to bring all Christians under his authority if they weren't already. Um, and it lasts about as long as Charlemagne lasts. Um, for the next 400, 500 years, the church and the emperors of Europe or the kings of Europe are going to be arguing with one another who has real authority. But for Charlemagne, it is a key moment where both finally the emperor and the church are in one, kind of one idea. They're together. And uh, that does not happen much. It does not happen often. But the idea, much like the Roman idea was to unite under one idea, to have one geographical entity with the Roman peace, the idea now was to have one Christian ruler, one Christian empire, united under the same culture, united under the same idea. And that's why it's so significant, because you can make the argument that's the idea. It doesn't happen very much. It doesn't happen hardly at all after Charlemagne. But he establishes a template that is going to be tried or united again and again and again. Will Europe ever really be united is the great question. Um, and it's eerie when you look at the maps of the great empires that have followed Charlemagne. They're all basically trying to accomplish the same political, geographical, and economic entity that was Charlemagne. Again, Napoleon tries it, Hitler tries it. All these quote unquote empires that try to conquer Europe are trying to reestablish the kingdom of Charlemagne. That's why he stands out in history. And again, some people say that's the birth of Europe. It's not going to be Islamic. It's not even really Roman in that sense because it's different geography. Um, but it's the same geographical region to this day, Europe. All the countries and people groups that exist in Europe today can draw a line to the nobility of Charlemagne for the most part. And of course, uh, you could add Norway, or you could add Denmark, and you could add Sweden. The Icelandic kingdoms, if you will, they get eventually get added to it. Uh, England is always its own separate case for the most part. But today, the continental Europe and even the European Union today can draw somewhat of a geographical entity and culture all the way back to Charlemagne. And I belabor the point for a reason. Okay. So, with all of that said, okay, I'm going to give you a list, and you should be following this on your sheet. Okay, what are Charlemagne's great accomplishments? Well, first, it is a continuation of the Roman idea, a single political unit that establishes a system and an order to life, regardless of what people group you're from. It happens to be a Frankish king who's in control, but there are many groups and clans that are not Franks. But he brings them all under one political unit and one idea, and he gets taxation from this, he gets wealth from this, and he establishes a system, a feudal system, where people are loyal and pledged to his ideas and his system. happens to be a Christian system as well. So, um, again, it's the idea is a birth of Europe. It's a political entity. The Holy Roman Empire in the year 800 is a continuation of the idea of Rome, and they just didn't want to give that up, despite the fact that it had been hundreds of years since there had been a Roman emperor on the throne in Western Europe. But he does accomplish the reestablishment of that idea. Number two, it's cultural unity. It's Christian. Um, it is it is a the first part of that is that it's Christian. But another thing that's significant is, and this is highly overlooked, but many of the great cities of Europe were really became great in this period of time. That's because part of Charlemagne's political genius was to recognize places of power. At this particular time, places of power happened to be on rivers because it controlled movement. It also controlled the economy. And so Charlemagne built a series of fortified cities in his kingdom and his empire along the great rivers of Europe. Now the Romans, close to this, many of these cities had their seeds in the Romans. Take a place like Vienna, great fortified city. It had its origin in the Romans. Some of the great uh, cities along the Rhine were also started by the Romans, but Charlemagne takes that to another degree and fortifies them. Now, we're a little bit away from the idea of a castle. Those really come into play in the Hundred Years' War in the 1200s and 1300s. But the idea of a fortified city is very much a part of the strategy of Charlemagne, where he could have troops stationed, almost a standing army, where he could have knights loyal to him and strike at anybody who might be rebellious, but also have centers of trade that were close to his military power. Um, and he had adjutants, or he had generals, or he had nobles that were loyal to him in these positions of power. And by the way, the people that he appointed eventually become very powerful, and they start families and dynasties of their own on down the line. Uh, but he had a wonderful sense of understanding where places of power were. This is a cultural thing. If you go to Europe, even to this day, there are centers, there are cities that were once their legacy is they were fortified cities. You can see by their naming of places. A lot of times there's such and such gate. Even London, you go to um, Ashgate or Aldersgate or wherever. That idea gate means that they were gates in city walls. They were fortified cities, uh, and that's true all over Europe. Most of the cities of Europe were once there because they were fortified military centers, and it was in the fortified military centers that trade occurred. They were economic centers. People could come in and trust that they were going to be protected by the law of the king in these fortified cities. It's also Christian. Most trade was overseen by the church. Most people don't know that. That's because they were considered to be Christian, they were considered to be trustworthy, and church officials often oversaw trade. Cathedrals were built in the middle of these fortified cities for worship, but also because they had places where they could have stalls, where they could set up trade, where they could come and commune and do business and do so under the law, under the protection of the church and under the protection of the king or emperor. So that's a cultural legacy that exists as a direct result of Charlemagne. Now, of course, different kings eventually emerged, different emperors eventually emerged, different cultures in terms of what regulations are, different economies, but it was all kind of started as one system in that particular period of time. All right, and then another one is the economic unity, which I just mentioned. The fortifications were on rivers. Uh, I meant to say that's culture, but it's also a continuation of economic, or it is economic, cultural, same thing. Um, and for the most part, uh, that economic reality cannot be overlooked. Europe, in this particular time, starts to emerge as incredibly wealthy. Um, Places like Flanders, which If you know World War One history, it's north, just north of France. It's part of France. It's also part of Belgium. That's a river region just north of Paris, um, almost forgotten in history. But from the time of Charlemagne to the time of the Renaissance, the 1500s, Flanders was one of the most wealthy economic regions in the world. Their primary uh, economic source of wealth was cloth. They had invented a system taking wool, which they had to go out and buy, they had to go out and find, and producing incredibly wonderful cloth. Sounds simple, but it was a centerpiece of an economy that produced enormous amount of taxation. It financed the kings of France for the next 600 years. Uh, it was, in many ways, and this is important, it was all feudal, it was all very basic, it was often just trade, but it also becomes a source of capitalism because many of the people who started to control this trade would work their way up into the nobility. There was a system of cash. Kings and emperors began to regulate this trade through the printing of coins. Now that coin and money had gone all the way back to the Romans. It really takes off under Charlemagne. Charlemagne, again, being an economic genius, all right, establishes a system of money that is constant throughout his empire. That's very important for unification. Having a common system of currency, a common system of trade is very important. It's very rudimentary, it's very basic. What I'm arguing here is this is just the start of capitalism. It's not capitalism yet, and we'll talk about that eventually when we get there. But the idea of selling something for profit outside of just I'm going to give you my wheat and my production because I want protection, which is what feudalism is, or I want return. I'm going to give you my services in return for something else. Um, Now they're starting to make extra, they make more, and they can sell that, and they can make wealth, they can make money, and they can exchange that for goods and services. What capitalism is, right? If you've got extra money, you can exchange it for goods and services, and buy other things, so to speak. So again, very, very important period of time. And then finally, and this is one of the most important periods of time, it's often what most people point to when they talk about Charlemagne, even above the economic and the political entities, etc. And that is Charlemagne reforms and changes the education of Europe. Um, Probably never heard of that before, but it is incredibly important. Charlemagne starts what is called the Carolingian Renaissance. I mentioned the Carolingian Empire. Remember, that's named after the series of Charles that exist in the Frankish kingdom. Well, this is Charles, or Carol in French, and it's called the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, most people are familiar with the Renaissance of the 1400s and 1500s. That's the Italian Renaissance. The truth is, there were several Renaissance before the Renaissance of the 1400s and 1500s. What is a Renaissance? Renaissance means a rebirth. It means um, a discovery, if you will, of knowledge or information that had already existed. It's almost always a rebirth or rediscovery of the Roman and Greek philosophers and education of the Greeks and Romans. This first happened not in Italy, not in the great famous artists or philosophers of the Italian Renaissance. It first happened in France under Charlemagne. Charlemagne recognized that a great deal of his wealth and his empire and his bureaucratic system was going to be dependent upon those who could count, those who knew how to run taxation, run bureaucracy. He wanted an empire where bureaucrats were educated. To do this, he needed to find educated teachers. The chief person he sponsored was a man named Alcuin. Alcuin was a monk who lived in England. England, interestingly enough, happened to be the center of education in the 600s and 700s. Now, again, if we're going with education, if we're going with terms, in the 600s and 700s, there was something called the Northumbrian Renaissance. Northumbria is a region in England, and it happens to be one of the great first Renaissances. In other words, the Greek philosophers, the writings of Aristotle and Plato, and the astronomy and the math of the Greeks were centered in England. This seems strange. England's all the way, it's on the opposite side of Europe from Greece. So how did this happen? Well, manuscripts of the Romans and Greeks were kept in places of learning in Roman centers of empire. Their manuscripts, their texts, their education, their poets, their literature, the ancient Greeks, etc., were all kept in libraries across the Roman Empire. When the barbarians started to invade, barbarians had no interest in whatsoever in these manuscripts, and they often burned them. Great libraries were burned and destroyed. The learning of the Greeks and Romans, we will sometimes will never know exactly what all disappeared in this particular period of time, but it is possible um, that some great thoughts were lost. But those who had wanted to preserve this thing began to look for places to save manuscripts. Safe places to go were to take them to remote corners of the empire and hide them. Happened to be that one of the most safest places to put the great texts and manuscripts of Rome happened to be in England and in Ireland. There's a great book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. That is because in the libraries of Ireland and in England, the great thoughts of Plato and Aristotle, Plato in particular, Aristotle was preserved mostly in the East. Okay. In other words, I don't want to belabor this too much, but much of the thinking of the Greeks was preserved in England. Some of it was preserved in the East, and eventually they come together into what we call modern education. But the point is that all of a sudden, in the monasteries, in the religious monasteries, which is where they kept these manuscripts, monks started to read them, and they started to philosophize and started to educate and put together a theory of what it meant to be educated based upon the thinking of the Greeks and Romans, and then also the early church fathers. In other words, a combination, what we talked about very early on, a combination of Christian thought with the thinking of Plato and Aristotle and Greek philosophy and Greek education. It forms the foundation of education as we know it today. How do we know this? Because out of those monasteries, which were preserving thoughts, uh, came Alcuin. And Charlemagne says, I want the best thinkers in my empire. And he invited a an English thinker to come and establish a system of education in his empire. And that's exactly what he did. And Alcuin looked at all the writings that he could find and looked at all the scholars. I mean, he wasn't alone, he had others, but he looked at all the philosophers and he said, basically, there is a system of education that the Romans followed, that the Greeks followed, and he codified it. He put it into one clear system. It was called the seven liberal arts. Um, there was a way to educate a person and a way to educate a thinker. And it was broken down into two parts. There was the trivium and the quadrivium, meaning the three studies and the four studies. Trivium means three, quad means four. Um, there's seven subject areas that an educated person must master to become really truly educated. Okay, those seven liberal arts, and I'm going to list them for you, and on your paper, all right, is asking you the question. So write this down. Okay. The trivium, or the first three subject areas of the seven liberal arts, are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar is basic information in all subject areas, by the way, not just the language that you speak. Grammar is just basic information. It is the nuts and bolts of anything you study. Logic is a way of thinking about that subject, and rhetoric is how you articulate or how you argue about that particular subject. To be an educated person, you must have all three in any area you study. Okay, you study the grammar of something, you study the logic of something, and you study the rhetoric of something. By the way, there's a huge movement across the United States called classical education, and the whole idea of classical education is that you reestablish these basic areas of learning. Okay, so it's grammar, logic, and rhetoric is the trivium. Right, that's the first three of the seven liberal arts. Okay, the bottom four, the second four, okay, are more specific. It's arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Okay, in those four areas are basically, you can make the cases, is all science. Okay, arithmetic is simply computing and accounting. It's it's the it's a little bit more than just adding things up. Um, it's more of a system of accounting and figures and how you keep track of particular the order. You can make the case that algebra, which is not part of this, by the way, is an arithmetic. Algebra does not become part of math until much later, until Isaac Newton, really. Okay. Geometry is spatial awareness. It is everything in architecture, um, anything related to that engineering, so to speak. Music is a science. It is the study of music was physics in the Middle Ages. It was nature's way of helping us understand how sound works. Um, the study of music was a science at this particular period of time. It was a religious science, and the most people would be shocked to know this because we consider it a fine art. But music was a hardcore science at one particular period of time. And then astronomy is again physics. It is advanced math. That's where they did study before they didn't call it calculus, they didn't call it anything else, but that's eventually where that all comes from, is the study of these things. Um, Alcuin established these were eventually called the seven liberal arts, meaning the freeing arts. That's what that word phrase liberal means. It means the freeing work of education. It is Charlemagne's sponsorship of Alcuin and Alcuin's system that becomes part of European culture. The modern university, all the way up into the 20th century, was built on the seven liberal arts. Now they changed over time. They added other things to them. They broke them up. They went to specialties. Um, more and more things were added. But the very basic idea of Western liberal arts education is born in this particular period of time. That's how important Charlemagne is. Now he doesn't establish universities; those do not come until the 1300s. But he establishes schools in monasteries and in cathedrals all over Charlemagne's empire. Again, Christianity is used as a unifying entity. It is a place where people can come together. Now, education is, I mean, we're talking about 98% of the people can't read. Okay, and an education person started with Latin. Uh, this is for the nobility. This is for the rich. This is for bureaucrats, for people in systems of government. But that is where it starts. Eventually, as people become more and more educated, and as education spreads, and as cathedral schools, as they were called, start to grow, more and more people come to them as a way to advance in society. Most nobles, if you were not going to inherit a system or a seat of power, would send their sons and their daughters to these cathedral schools. It's not uncommon for women to be educated at all. Many women were educated in accountancy, arithmetic. Uh, they were wonderful thinkers in many cases. There's all kinds of evidence of this. Uh, and within the nobility, there were many educated women um, across the board. But it all starts, and again, we're talking about 2% at best of European society for about 300 or 400 years till the emergence of universities. But also in these cathedral schools, this is where, I mean, you can imagine these monks, or you can imagine these individuals reading these texts, reading the great philosophers, and they start coming up with their own ideas. They start writing these things down. The birth of Christian, well, I shouldn't say birth, but the continuation of Christian philosophy and ideas, uh, an articulation of Christian ideas, dealing with some of the great philosophies of the period of time come from these monks. Uh, there is no Western philosophy without this revolution, without this education revolution. So it's incredibly important for us to understand across the board. Okay, so there you have it. Charlemagne, for all those reasons, is incredibly significant. He's incredibly important as an individual. Now, last thing I want to say about Charlemagne, it's very interesting. Charlemagne is such a unifier that both the Germans and the French consider him the father of their nation. If you look at his great portraits, you see the fleur de lis, which is the great symbol of France, and you see the eagle, the great eagle of Germany. Both of those are symbols of a nation, and, and again, it's terribly ironic that they hate each other. They become great rivals all the way into eventually the world wars of the 20th century. Um, and I mean, they're uh, two peoples that you would never think at one time came from the same from basically the same source. Charlemagne is considered the great emperor of both kingdoms and both empires, and that's a unique and interesting point in history. Now, just as an idea, and I'm not going to cover this in great detail, his empire falls apart almost immediately. As soon as he's dead, this great genius is gone. His children are not nearly as gifted as he is. And to avoid a complete and utter civil war and chaos, they split the kingdom into three. Interesting enough, those divisions, Germany, France, and what is today Spain. Um, and those three regions are still divided to this day based upon that long history because those three rulers have children. They all fight over their thrones. They eventually say, "Hey, I want to claim the other's throne." They fight these wars. Uh, Civil wars go back and forth. Popes start arguing with the various emperors and who's in charge. Then you have the Viking invasions, which creates more chaos. I mean, it's just uh, Charlemagne's idea is gone as soon as Charlemagne is there. Well, I shouldn't say his idea is gone. His empire is gone as soon as he's gone. But his idea and his legacy is long lasting, even to this day in many ways. Okay, so there you have it. The importance of a moment, the importance of one great man, Charles the Great or Charlemagne. Okay, so I'll say, might be the easiest course you've ever had in college. I'm hoping you're learning at least some tidbits and some things. You've got an assignment that I'm going to be posting up there that I want you to take seriously and do. You're going to have a final that is going to sum all this up together. For the most part, uh, I view this class as very simple. I just have one grand goal, and that's to help you find some elements in history that have contributed to our modern society to this day. Okay, so keep that in mind, and I'll do the best to keep producing these, and we've only got a few more before your break. So anyway, have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.